The program in brief is we're going to have a number of presentations after the opening session. And after the presentations, there'll be an opportunity for about 20 minutes where we can engage with the presenters. And there'll be a short discussion, panel discussion, and we'll also have an opportunity for a question and answer session. The moderator for today is going to be Olivier. He's the coordinator for disaster risk financing and the insurance program with the World Bank. He's going to assist me, and we're going to take you through the process in quite a structured way. In opening, the Minister for Cooperative Governance yesterday made a statement that disaster management is everybody's business, and which includes the financial sector. We heard a lot of presentations and discussions yesterday at the onset of the impact of weather-related issues and what the impact of disaster has on countries, on the economies, and how we deal with those. And today we want to speak a bit about how we get the partnerships going with governments and with the financial sectors to try and mitigate some of the risks that are related to this business. I think without any further ado, let's ask Olivier to take us through a brief opening address, and then we will start with the presentations. Just to say that we have 5 presentations, and we'll introduce each of the presenters as we go ahead. Olivier, thanks.
Thank you, Ken. I'll try to be brief, given the high-level panel we have been able to invite today. Just a comment from the World Bank perspective. It's a very important topic for us at the World Bank, disaster risk financing, particularly in the broader disaster risk management and the climate change adaptation agenda. And I think one of the key messages you're gonna hear today is that disaster risk financing is not a standalone activity. It's really a tool to assist decision makers and policymakers in dealing with disaster, the impact of natural disasters. Sub-Saharan Africa is particularly exposed to natural disasters, including drought and floods. And those two disasters impact, on average, 80% of the loss of life, and about 70% of economic losses are related to drought and floods in Africa. What do we mean by disaster risk financing? I will not answer the question now, but this is exactly what we're going to try to discuss in the next hour. This can be addressed at the macro level. It's an important topic for the Ministry of Finance to be able to mobilize funds when a disaster strikes, and then help ultimately implementing agencies like the National Disaster Management Offices to quickly react and provide support and to help the needed people. This can also be seen at the micro level with the help of the insurance industry. And this insurance industry is quite active in South Africa, and how the insurance industry and the private insurance industry can also support the long-term reconstruction of the impact of natural disasters. Overall, disaster risk information is critical. And particularly from the insurance perspective, this is a kind of lifeblood, if you wish. Without good information, good quality information, it's very difficult to design any cost-effective solutions to deal with natural disasters. So it's very important to have a good understanding of the risks faced in those countries. Now, as we're going to discuss in a few minutes, risk assessment also may mean many things. And financial risk assessment is one way to understand risks. And what we're going to discuss in this session is that for financial decision makers, the type of information that is needed may be slightly different from other types of information for other policymakers. So it's also very important to try to identify the right information. The role of the World Bank here, in fact in this broader agenda, is really to facilitate this discussion. As you will see here, many countries, both in Africa and outside Africa, have been involved for some time on disaster risk financing. So our job is just to facilitate and to have a kind of open forum on what disaster risk financing means and what are the limitations of disaster risk financing. The very last thing we want you to think is that this is the silver bullet to deal with natural disaster, with the disaster risk management. It's just one tool that can be, in some cases, very efficient to address some specific needs, but this is definitely not the ultimate solution when it comes to disaster risk management. I'm going to stop here, and again, I think it's a very nice opportunity today, based on the presentations we're going to have in a few minutes, just to brainstorm together and to ask, I would say, naive, candid questions, and to be a bit provocative in this session, again, to see and to discuss together what are the opportunities and challenges for disaster risk financing in the context of Africa. So without further ado, I will pass the floor to Ken.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to start with the presentations. Our first presentation is a programmatic approach to fiscal disaster risk assessment and management. Marcus Schrader is the counselor for the Swiss Economic Cooperation and Development in South Africa, and he's going to be leading us in the presentation. Marcus, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everybody. Probably find yourself some chairs. There are 2 here, 1 behind there, 2 other chairs. So there's ample space. Just don't mind and come from the back. If you want to stand all morning, you're welcome, of course, as well. Yeah, you've seen the title. We're short on time, so we just skip to the next one. Indeed, it's very important also from our perspective, from the Swiss Economic Cooperation, to emphasize that risk financing is obviously not the one-size-fits-all solution to disaster risk management. This, for us, is one part in the puzzle. A very big one, which I'm not going to talk about, is which basically comes either before or after that, which are measures of risk reduction or recovery, which make part of actually our Swiss, what we call humanitarian aid. And you would be talking there about, for instance, questions like construction codes, land zoning, emergency preparedness in terms of risk reduction, or in terms of recovery, you would be talking about emergency response, emergency relief, and reconstruction. That is not what I'm going to talk about. But equally important, obviously, as much as many more topics which are discussed here. As you see, our main goal, you see to your right, is sustainable economic development and integration into the global economy. Now you say, what does this have to do with disaster? Well, if you just look then on the left-hand side, which are our pillars, where we're working in, you'll see that there is ample space actually for risk. And whenever you're prone to risk, as one part of our activities, we're also looking into which kind of risk financing activities can we provide in order to mitigate these risks. It is by far not the only instrument we have. Probably it is like 10% of our portfolio at maximum, which deals with this kind of activities and issues. But definitely it is an issue in all of these different pillars which you see to your very right. So if you look at the sound financial infrastructure, if you're looking at a good business environment, affordable basic infrastructure, and trade policy promotion even there, we'll come to the examples a bit later. Also in terms of our partner countries, you've got there a few examples. Obviously South Africa in terms of droughts and floods would add another example in here. Shows you how actually our partner countries might be affected by that. What is quite interesting is if you're looking into that, that different countries may take different approaches to it, and rightfully so. I mean, disaster risk financing can't even on the level of financing just work with a one-size-fits-all approach, because you actually have different countries with different capabilities. As you may see here, as an example, we are actually within the Swiss Economic Cooperation working and focusing on middle-income countries with the aim to have them as an economic hub for the region. If you're looking for middle-income countries, they're in a very, very specific situation also when it comes to risk financing. If you look at the very Swiss example, I mean, we would probably raise most of our funding, which we would need for that, from issuing long-term fixed-rate securities in our domestic market. We'll have access to a wide range of liability management tools, swaps, buybacks, exchange, and we have quite some tools at hand to manage risks. On the other end, if you're looking into more lower economies, you have very limited choices in debt instruments and risk instruments, and you're often restricted to financial terms and currencies offered by multilateral lenders, Obviously, if you don't get into risk financing at all, then afterwards on the recovery side, the international donor community will have to come in and provide its part, because you simply haven't got more choices. If you're a middle-income country, you're somewhat stretched and you're somewhere in between. And obviously it depends a bit on your stage of development, where you are and what you can do. But actually you may have some more opportunities here, and you may want to look into other options which are available. You also may have a basic enabling environment which you need, and there I'm talking about the institutional and the human capacity, but I'm also talking, and that is quite important, about the long-term vision. That's a bit similar to your debt management issues, where you probably need to take a longer horizon than just from one election to the next, which also means you need to have your political support in the country to go onto that long-term vision. And that is also why in some countries, presumably disaster risk financing is regarded as a medium to high-risk issue, also from then your financing institutions or your reinsurers, whomever you have there, because you need to have this macroeconomic stability, otherwise you can't venture into these fields. What is very important, and the examples show it very nicely here, and that can't be overemphasized, I'm sorry, even in terms of crisis also in Europe, that you have to look beyond the financial and economic crisis, where also all countries are prone to, but you have to look into your proneness to disasters, your changing patterns of climate change, and what that actually will lead you to in terms of disaster, and you see how that can affect your GDP and obviously then the entire economy. In turn, if you think from the perspective of a development partner, when we are financing certain activities with our partner countries to look into certain of these issues, what happens actually with our money as from purely an investor's perspective if afterwards this country is so prone to certain disasters that 10 years down the line actually all your investment which you ventured into with your partner country actually was gone due to an unforeseen risk or something where you didn't look into. Therefore, the solution indeed is act before it hits. And therefore, you need to understand the vulnerability and resilience as a contingent liability, and I think that is a very key point. And that is something which is often overlooked. It's quite obvious why for us, because for us this contingent liability is often implicit, and the law doesn't usually clearly define the financial responsibility of the government due to disaster. Nevertheless, and that's what we're seeing all over the place, including Switzerland, we're not an exemption here, is you act as a financer, insurer, reinsurer of last resort anyway, because in the end, your citizens will turn back to government and say, look, somebody has to bail us out here. We had some flooding, some drought recently, what we had in Switzerland, we had some rocks falling down on the railways lines are blocked, the transport mechanisms from the German-speaking to the Italian-speaking parts, which is behind the Alps, is now blocked. An entire part of the population, that's at least 10%, now get into an uprising because the transport corridor is blocked. So what do you do as a government? You have to step in there, and you have to see. And you've got certain ex-ante and ex-post instruments to finance natural disasters. In the aftermath of a disaster, you have immediate expenditure, and your needs are high. Immediately available financial resources are usually limited, creating a liquidity gap. And again, if you're then a lower income country or also an emerging markets, at that moment of the crisis, if you want to go borrowing, obviously the market will ask you for higher rates. So if you act before it hits, you may venture into a cheaper solution here. And obviously you also want to take an approach which relies on an optimal combination of different mechanisms, so that your risk insurance is not the only way of dealing with the matter. Finally, here on the panel, on the screen, you see a few of the mechanisms we have currently at hand. They reach from sovereign disaster risk financing over property catastrophe risk insurance and agriculture insurance. So you might see, well, that's quite diverse. And not all of this obviously talks to the public sector. Nevertheless, we find it quite interesting. Without going further into the details due to, unfortunately, time constraints, I'd nevertheless like to show you that there are linkages between all these. For instance, I just have 5 bullets here. The macro-level agricultural risk stress tests can be a building block for sovereign financial risk assessments. Your vulnerability sovereign financial risk assessments can be a building block for more detailed actuarial risk assessments for product pricing. The legal regulatory review of the insurance sector is there to support insurance penetration, enabling and enhancing the private sector products, for instance, pooling. Then you can have a scaling up of insurance products on the base of all these, for instance, weather risks, or again, pooling, to include governments, or you can scale down that insurance product, for instance, pools, to include the agricultural supply chain. Finally, strengthening the risk management capacity, for instance, of agricultural supply chains, but also of the housing market, which you saw there, and the private sector in general, reduces the contingent liability of governments. So even if you're looking into supporting the private sector in that, obviously, your risk to be the reinsurer of last resort as a government gets more limited, because basically the private sector can take over some of the activities on its own. So that's in a very nutshell and very short what I have to do. I see the stop sign here, and I stop there. In terms of questions, I'll sit on the pen.
Thank you very much. Our next presentation will deal with the developing a sovereign disaster risk financing strategy in the context of disaster risk management, and we're going to be listening to a Mexican experience. Our presenter is Manuel Lobato. He's the former head of insurance, pension and social security in the Ministry of Finance in the government of Mexico. Manuel, you have the floor.
Good morning, all. Thanks to the bank for having me here. Thank you, all of you. Let me talk you. I want to start from what Marcus said, that I think is very interesting and very relevant, not only for disaster risk management strategy, but from the Ministry of Finance perspective, which is act before it hits. I think that it sounds in our head, act before it hits. So it's very important. I think that perhaps many of you do not remember, but in 1895 we have a very big quake, and it shakes us not only from the physical point of view, but from our state of mind. You know, we needed to react, and that quake changed our view of facing natural disasters. Mexico, as South Africa and many other countries represented here, it's a beautiful country, and it is a potential hub, you know, for trade and for the rest of the Americas. But of course, economists say that there is no such thing as a free lunch, and we are facing several natural disasters. Let me tell you that with that in mind, by the mid-2000s, let's say by 2006, Mexico had had made very significant improvements in terms of disaster risk financing. And what I want to say about disaster risk financing, it's just the way we face, from the financial point of view, the fact that we need to, someday we're going to wake up with a disaster out there. And you know, yesterday many presenters said that disasters are just around the corner. They are increasing, and population exposed had been increasing too. You know, what do? We had, by mid-2000s, we have two main strategies for disaster risk financing. That is to cope with disaster from the financial point of view. One was a budgetary vehicle, you know, the federal budget vehicle. It was our Fonden. Fonden was created in '96, and to financial support, let's say, the disaster risk management. I think that Ken knows about it, and we had a financial arm for disaster risk management. And it facilitates in the sense that it is the budgetary vehicles that provides funding to attend these events. Not only that, I think that Fonden plays a very important role as in economic terms, in sense of it solves some coordination problems, not only in terms of operations, but in terms of the budgetary operations to finance natural disasters. Now, we also had some risk transfer mechanisms what were there is that we have some insurance policies, for example, for hospitals, for schools, and for water infrastructure. But they were not so great. We had them, they were working, but they're not working at the best level. Also, in the international arena, in 2006, the Mexican government, the Ministry of Finance, we call Hacienda, and I think that many people has heard that name here, Hacienda, placed a cat bond. We call it CATMEX, and it protected the Mexican finances against the earthquake risk. It was a coverage around $450 million, and it covered a specific zone, the most exposed zones in Mexico. So let's say we have something just for an illustration like this. We have two pieces, large pieces, and small pieces in the part below. We have CATMEX and Fonden, of course, with what's the budget. It was another way to call it the budget, you know. And below was the insurance for schools, for water infrastructure, and for hospitals. But there was not a coherent vision of it. There was there was not a clear direction we wanted to go in terms of disaster risk financing. Then we were lacking two main elements to develop risk transfer mechanisms. What is important to develop risk transfer mechanisms? The first thing is, I think that Marcus was saying, and the underlying discussion of what he was saying, is that in the end, we need to diversify our sources of funding when a disaster hits. We need to act before it hits. Again, and we need several, because anyway, you may say, well, you know, the government has a very large balance. We can absorb any hit. Well, that's in theory, you know, because you have a lot of social programs and other economic programs that you need to develop, and it is not only part of the economy, but it's also a part of a government program. So you need to act. And you need to have the funding to react, because you need to give the population a right answer in the right moment. So you need to have a lot of funding sources to better cope with all of this when you most need it. I am not going to enter into the details of what are the advantages of it that Marcus quickly went through it in his presentation. Now, what are these two main elements? And you know, recently on June 16, 20 days ago, the World Bank and the government of Mexico presented a book under the G20 umbrella. I think that this book is very important, because these books help us to understand precisely this. Hacienda, with the support of UNAM is the largest public university in Mexico, and Agroacemex is the public insurance company, built up two key elements. What? An inventory of main assets covered by Fonden. Roads, around 140,000 kilometers, around 7,000 bridges. Hospitals, around 15 hospitals. Schools, around 2,100 schools. And housing for low-income people, around 12 million dwelling units. You know, this is very important. What to cover, what we need to protect when a disaster hits. That is an inventory. What? And not only that, you know, later talking to the Vice Ministry of Finance back then, I was telling him that he could use it to try to validate the expansion programs of several assets. For example, do we need a hospital here? Or do we need another school in this area? If we have, you know, because this inventory has location, replacement value, and the location is georeference, so we know exactly in terms of satellite, in terms of the globe, where is the school, and we have pictures of the schools. We have pictures of every 100 meters of each road. So we also have this information to do something else. And not only that, we had what to cover, but against what we're going to cover it, which is a modeling system for earthquake and hurricane risk. You know, someone perhaps talking, or later we're going to talk about in this conference about flood risk, that this is very important for South Africa. You know, models are getting there in terms of flood, and it is going to be something very important to cover in the future for Mexico, because Mexico is also exposed to flood. That then is what to cover, against what to cover, and what are the results of not covering it. That is to say, what is the impact in financial terms of when a disaster hits. That's very important, because this helps us to get a right insurance for our infrastructure. Later, I'm going to be quick now. In October 2009, we're partnering with the World Bank and with a very big insurance and investment bank, we placed Multicat Mexico 2009. We are renewing Multicat this year. We are working with the World Bank. Let me tell you that it is multi because we have two perils covered, earthquake and hurricane, not only one as in our 2006 cat bond. It is a parametric cat bond. I am not going to enter into the details, but if you go to the World Bank, there are many publications on this particular instrument. And then later, in 2010, we placed what we call excess of loss insurance. What is excess of loss insurance is that, you know, you have been hit by several events. So when we spend some money, then the insurance comes in. And the money from the insurers comes to the Mexican government to help Mexican population. It is like when you hit a car, you know, you don't have enough money, you hit your car, the insurance comes and pays for the reparation or the reparation of the other car. That is it's an insurance, an excess of loss insurance. But in this case, you know, you have to spend a minimum amount for the insurers to come to help you. The Mexican government just renewed this a few days ago while announcing this in the book, the G20 book that was co-written by the World Bank with Mexico. Just to wrap up, we also have another strategies. You know, we've been working to ensure and to protect turnpikes, which is not covered at the first loss level. We have to develop some housing for low-income population, and we need to go on into the deepening this risk analysis that we have made, and we also are partnering with the local governments to have for they to have a risk transfer strategy. In the end, what we have is not this block with, you know, without sense, but it's another block. We want to know, we know now where we want to go and what are the steps behind this, and to reach this and after this. Thank you very much to all of you. Have a nice day.
Thank you, Manuel. The next presentation is going to deal with public and private partnership for disaster risk assessment and financing, and we're going to have a South African experience. The presenter is Debbie Donaldson. She's the General Manager of Strategy and Planning at the South African Insurance Association. Debbie.
Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for the opportunity to be here and to share this experience. As I talk through these 4 points that we're going to share and the process that we started in November last year with the National Disaster Management Centre, I just want to indicate that from a South African insurance point of view, we represent 59 members, all the way from a niche underwriter through to a reinsurer and a classic underwriter. And it was a natural relationship for us to engage with the National Disaster Management Centre, because if you look at the National Disaster Management Centre's role in South Africa, essentially the triangle summarizes what they're seeking to achieve. And they bring together, from a government point of view, a stakeholder, which essentially their key focus is about reducing systemic risk. And the reason we engaged right from the beginning was because we recognize that in 10 to 15 years from now, we are going to be operating in a different environment. And we require interventions to happen now in order to manage that outcome in the future. And we needed to partner with someone who could bring us all the points of contact and the stakeholders within government, whether they be a functional department like the Department of Agriculture or the National Treasury. Essentially, that might be a functional area, but also they could bring together people who work on the ground in various levels of government to manage disaster. So local authorities, provincial or regional authorities, and national authorities and frameworks. From an insurance perspective, we really wanted to bring into that process our risk mitigation behaviors and ways of doing things, because ultimately when we come into an environment, we bring that behavioral change, and we really wanted to couple with people who want to bring about behavioral change, not just put in 17 fire engines because you have a risk of fire in a particular area, but how do you go about changing behavior on the ground? And we wanted to bring that to the party, as well as bring alternative mechanisms for funding risks that occur. So essentially, given the South African scenario, we also, amongst all of this in preparing for disasters for the future, we're also preparing for economic growth. And so the practices that we put in place for economic growth today affect our risks of the future. So it was important to bring that into the party. So we talk a lot of different things. We speak differently about risk, we use different terminology, but ultimately we share the common interests of citizens in our country. And we might service them differently, we might come to solutions differently, but we all land up in the same space. The thing that really is in common is that we use the same frameworks to enact what we do. We use the same legal frameworks, the same disaster management frameworks to approach things. And so we really need to make sure that as we come together in this partnership, that those frameworks are enabling us to really play to our strengths in this process. Also, we need to recognize, we've recognized that you can't just look at an insured and uninsured populations as clinically as, well, they are insured or they're uninsured. They live in an integrated environment. We live in an integrated environment. We're dependent on each other. So as the disaster occurs, essentially, if we don't look at that through a social economic lens as opposed to just a financial loss, we miss an opportunity to recognize that if we don't uplift and spread insurance risk further to people from a recovery point of view, essentially people who can't recover become part of a different risk. It might not be the disaster anymore, but they become part of a bigger risk. And that's a volatile situation when you do live in our environment. And so we can't stand by and say, well, we can't use other mechanisms to start thinking creatively about impacts on citizens of South Africa. We need to get our head around how we actually make solutions work effectively and together. So one of the things really has been a challenge in understanding our roles and responsibilities, being very clear that everybody has an equal stake in the outcome and that they're very interlinked. So you can't ignore your partners, you can't ignore the community that you want to help. You actually need to find the voice of the community. And there's many sessions in this forum and in this conference that we're hoping will also give us some insight to build into our thinking on this journey that we're taking. So essentially, we need to enable the leadership. It's pointless us putting in process a reactive response to something because right now it's of a need. You know, maybe right now we need to educate a community. But if we just have that one single response, that doesn't mean it's sustainable or has longevity. So in engaging with the National Disaster Management Centre, the South African Insurance Association has really relied on their ability to guide us in creating something that can come to a legal agreement together with our Minister of Cooperative Governance, which essentially will be sustainable beyond the leadership that is negotiating that agreement today. How do we create structures and mechanisms together with our provinces, together with our local authority that's beyond the leadership of today? And it was spoke about earlier, beyond the political standing, because this is a citizen issue. So essentially, in bringing together this memorandum of agreement and coming to agreement, we want that agreement to cover the entire risk management life cycle. We don't only want to be reactive. We need to build in prevention strategies now if we want to build resilient cities of the future. So we want to decrease the risk, decrease the systemic risk for everybody, and ultimately have a community impact. It's all pointless if we have this theoretical exercise without having a difference at a community level. And we want to do that through shared data and knowledge. And that's not a simple little ask. Everybody's nervous about that. There's lots of challenges around that. And we need to do that through educating the role players and building the trust that is required when you go into a public-private partnership. It's not straightforward. And ultimately increase the principles of insurance to actually get increased cover in the country and find other ways to manage these financial impacts. So you can have any kind of conceptual map. We can work on any model you like. You have many models of your own. But an important aspect of looking at a model is that you can see at a glance the relationship, the broader relationship, not just of one loss, but all of the activities that link systemically and converge. They have relationships to each other. So if you just look at the top, you start at the top of this diagram looking at large losses, and we say there's human impact, okay, just marked in red. In a loss, you have human impact, people lose jobs, you basically have material damage to the area. An example here would have been an example that happened in the Western Cape in 2009. We had a massive fire on the side of the mountain. So essentially, those losses is what we're ultimately, we're looking at it from the risk perspective, not from the actual emergency service perspective. We take a look at it saying, drill down from the fire, from the flood, from the tremors, etc. Look at the risk from that perspective. Start there, and we can look at this multiple ways. But try to find a language which we can both speak, that at a glance you can speak to each other, no matter if I'm the CEO of an insurance company or the head of finance or the minister of finance. I need to be able to look at this and say, what are we actually talking about? So you look at the large losses, you then look at the vulnerabilities that are attached to that. And it could be, in the case of this fire, it was a lack of adherence to regulations. Someone just chucked their cigarette out. They're on holiday, they chucked their cigarette out the window. Given the seasonality of the situation and the knowledge and skills, we had to respond to that major disaster. And so these things have different relationships. I mean, this example might not be perfect in its purest view, but it gives you a sense of how they interconnect. Ultimately, given the situation in South Africa, we have a natural environment and we need to preserve it. It's one of our assets as well as the disaster, as the physical assets. So the state of our ecosystems and what we're doing with our ecosystems does drive up the losses. And how are we building that into our thinking? And ultimately then the mitigation may be around town planning, it may be around land use, it may be around management functions, but it won't necessarily just be about the financial instrument that we're using at the time. So really want to implore upon you that this journey for us has been a very interesting one. It started at COP17 when the South African Insurance Association was invited by the World Bank to participate in that process in looking at alternative risk financing, and I thank you for that. I think it spurred a lot of our thinking in our approach. We then had a strategic think tank in March of this year where we brought together the stakeholders that came through the National Disaster Management Centre, and they've coordinated all these stakeholders within government to have a discussion about, is this worthwhile? Do we have the appetite, actually? Because don't start this if you don't have the appetite, because this is not an easy trip. This is a complex, you have to have resilience around this trip, and you must be committed. The people in the negotiation better be committed to coming out the other end, because this is not simple and easy. It's not everything. And so we had the think tank in March, and we decided we do want to collaborate. We do need to do something effectively together, and we can learn from each other. We can get past the problems. So essentially, this is part of our journey in learning and in sharing in the experiences that you bring to the party. And we want a memorandum of agreement by the end of December, ideally. And we want those strategic think tanks, those design think tanks that look at the systemic risk to really say, okay, looking at the systemic risk in the diagram I showed you earlier, if these factors, if there's a lot of convergence around one particular issue, then let's go for an intervention in that particular issue because it can have a multiple impact as opposed to trying to react daily. So thank you for your time and thanks for the sign. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Debbie. Our next presentation is going to be looking at the Malawi experience with disaster risk management and financing for agriculture. Dice Kachingwe is the is in the risk management unit in the Malawi Ministry of Agriculture. So, Dice, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks, ladies and gentlemen. I'll be taking you through this presentation, and basically the objective of this presentation is to share with you experience with disaster risk management and financing for agriculture. Our definition of risk in this context is that of where a disaster happens in terms of, for example, severe drought, which in turn affect production of maize. So we are looking at a macro level derivative program that has focused on government exposure at a macro level. And the target crop in this program is maize. And then the technical work for the program began as late as 2004 when government came up with a comprehensive framework to make sure that we address the issues of food security in a comprehensive manner using market-based tools. Basically, the starting point was motivated by the drought that happened in 2004, where the country suffered huge food shortfalls. The objective of the program has been to improve disaster risk assessment and early warning tools, to identify contingent sources of financing that can be used to support responses, strengthen government risk management capacity, that is to prepare government to integrate market-based solutions into its own plans and to work with market independently. And then number 4 is to to improve planning and budgeting for national disasters. Now, before I take you into the actual contract structure, I thought I should expound really on the program itself. So it's a kind of program where we are ensuring the national maize crop against severe drought. And I want you to underscore the word severe drought. On the understanding that imports or food imports have tended to be costly, and the country is very much interested to strike a balance between achieving exports as well as food security for the people. As most of you are aware in this room that staple foods tend to be very politically sensitive, and in fact, in other countries, they have even collapsed the governments. If people do not have food, you better take care as a politician. Now, in terms of the contract structure, that's basically the design. I may not take you in the nitty-gritties. Maybe during the discussion time, you might be asking the questions. But we, as government, I want you to focus on the down box where we have structured the arrangements of the contract. So here is government of Malawi, through World Bank as brokers. We pay a premium to a market counterpart. In this case, is Swiss Re. Of course, government of Malawi also has an obligation to supply weather data through a data cleaner. So that data from the sampled weather stations is transmitted to a data cleaner, who then transmits that data to the market counterparty, which is the insurance company, Swiss Re in this case. Now, the whole contract also is governed by a model, what we call the Malawi Maize Index Production Model. The model is basically has an index, or where a trigger has to be made, an index that reflects the water requirement satisfaction for crop, in this case, maize. So if rain has not come adequately, that means I'm sure most of you here are the technicians and know this stuff well. It will trigger a payout beyond a certain, or at a certain trigger level. In this case, in our context, it's 90% Malawi Maize Index in units. In terms of the numbers, well, the type of contract is it's a put option, and the premium is that much, 499,000, basically 500,000 US dollars. Maximum payout is 5 million, okay, 4.4 million. Payout per commodity index. So it's not like once you trigger a payout, then you access the whole lot. It's actually per commodity index. Basically here I'm just trying to elaborate in terms of the payout. So that slanting line is showing that it's indeed a per unit index. I mean per unit payout. So from 90 as a trigger level, if you reach maybe 89 or 70, it will trigger different payouts as shown on the horizontal axis. Of course, that's the maximum payout, as I said. And that's the trigger level. This is just an example of how we fared in 2011, 2012. When you look at the black line there, it's a horizontal straight black line. That's the basis, actually the historic average for about over 30 years. Now the red line is showing, okay, the assumption is that rain will come as usual. But suppose there is a severe drought and it has led to shortfalls in production, then you see that red line. But that red line has to go down beyond that 90 Malawi Maize Index for us to trigger a payout. And what we saw in the last season, which just ended in April, just last April, is that we came closer to 90, and everyone was a bit excited, thinking that we would pay a trigger. But now it was tricky, and then it started going up like that, and eventually lost. We didn't trigger a payout. By the way, it is done at the end of the season in April. So for each month, they compute the maize index. So you find in some months, maybe it could be 89. In some months, it will be 91. But at the end of the day, the average has to be below 91. And we were not lucky enough. So we didn't trigger a payout. But let me be positive again that this program, I think it's a comprehensive program, as I said, looking at different tools, market-based tools, including warehouse receipts, including put options. So we are exploring all those tools. And indeed, I just forgot, as early as 2005, Malawi managed to successfully import maize through the use of one of these tools. I think it's a put option, where you put contracts in the understanding that once maize becomes scarce and prices are volatile, you just access the maize within the market arrangements of call option or put option. So this is just a sketchy idea of how the program has run, but I think it's a very useful program, and it's still work in progress. And if done properly, if we understand the risks that are involved, understanding the subject matter, portraying it well, and communicating it well to the policymakers, politicians, it is workable. Because the advantage is that once a payout is triggered, you don't, it's timely. Within a short time, you access the funds and you buy the required commodity. So in terms of the next steps, at policy level, government, with concerns that, why haven't we triggered a payout since the last consecutive years? So government is at a position where we are still considering whether to proceed with the program or consider other means or other tools. Technically, we are reviewing the modeling approach. Where have we gone wrong? Maybe the sampling of weather stations, or we need to put in other parameters that can improve the transaction strategy. At institutional level, government is considering taking advantage of funding and expertise from different areas to support this work. I think that's all I had for you. Thanks for listening. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Darius. The last presentation we're going to be listening to is on the African risk capacity. Our presenter is Neil Cole. He's the Chief Director with the African Economic Integration, and he's with the National Treasury of the South African Government. So, Neil, we are ready to listen to you.
Don't have a backup. Okay, I promise I did submit the presentation. So maybe while the presentation is being loaded, let me firstly thank Ken and Olivia for the opportunity. We approached the forum because we believed that this facility was a facility that we wanted to use this opportunity to present to the forum. It's a Pan-African facility, and I suppose that's part of the caveat that I need to present to you. I work for the National Treasury in South Africa. I encountered this facility as it was being debated at the African Union. It was being debated in a forum of senior Treasury officials and also amongst finance ministers. And I suppose the advantage of presenting at the very end is that there are several common principles that have run through all the presentations, and I certainly do not need to repeat them. One of those principles is a principle that was shared by Marcus right at the beginning, is that the way that we all know how disasters work, and in particular the way that disasters work in Africa, is that the event occurs. We then assess, we then go out and appeal, we find the funding, and then we respond. And in particular, when it comes to drought, many of the kind of interventions that can be taken are delayed, and in the case of drought, a lot of that then turns into famine and results in the loss of life. So a point that Marcus also made as a common principle that runs through many of these presentations is that many of us here, I'm sure, would like disasters or disaster response, disaster assistance to work in the following way. And that is that we take some preventive action before the event takes place. And in terms of the type of presentations that are being made, what we are saying is that let's do some risk modeling, let's look at the populations that are going to be affected if an event occurs, and let's work on some cost estimation. At least where I'm sitting in the National Treasury, we know that we can plan better when we have a better idea of the kind of money that we are going to have available to spend. And in the business that I'm sure many of you are involved in, it's important to do contingency planning. And you'll hear that this presentation or this facility is also a lot about that contingency planning. So have that preventive response put in place as an ex-ante measure, so that when the event happens, you've made the assessment where there was an appeal necessary that has taken place, and the funding will be then made available much quicker. So what is the ARC? The African Risk Capacity. This is the project of the African Union, as I said. It has been designed and established as an African-owned facility. It is essentially a financial entity that would provide participating African Union member states contingent funds for now in the case of a drought. But the modeling is continuing, and there's further examination to see over time how this facility can also look into covering other types of disasters. So in concept, it is essentially a quick disbursing fund after drought, enabling a more timely response. So addresses one of the important principles that has been identified. It is intended to reduce the management costs by pooling risks across regionally diverse weather systems, and we will look at some examples of how the cost is reduced by pooling. Which I suppose is how most insurances that we deal with, whether it is our comprehensive household insurance, our car insurance, works. It works because of pooling. And it works because in the pool you have a diverse grouping of clients, or in this case, a diverse grouping of countries. So the intention is to lower the cost to governments of disaster relief, and also the impact of the drought. And by doing so, the ARC intends to transfer resources and decision-making to African governments. And that's particularly important if you think of how many African governments deal with responses to drought, is that they often have to turn, in most cases, to donors in order to finance the measures that need to be taken once an event has occurred. And what this does is that it is a premium that you pay. The payout is a payout that you as a government is entitled to. And the decisions that you take is based on a contingency plan that you have in place, but essentially you the owner of how that money is going to be spent. And then very importantly, it shifts the risk away from vulnerable populations and their governments to the ARC, which is in this case better equipped to handle those kind of risks. So on the cost efficiencies, if we look at the horizontal axis, 42, the number 42 there represents a grouping of countries, probably I think around about 36 countries, and also more than one season of a country. So the 42 is made up of a combination of countries and seasons, and then the vertical axis is the estimated worst-case drought response costs. So what we see there, as we add more countries and as we add more seasons, the amount of cost efficiencies increase. So the blue indicates the cumulative worst-case drought by country in a pool. So if every single country should act as an individual country, take out insurance, the cost of that is shown by the blue line. And then this other funny color, which I can best describe as an off shade of red, is the worst-case drought of the pool. So the difference between the two then shows the cost efficiency. And this is a slide that people in the insurance industry are more familiar with. I mean, this is what you need to know in order for you to ensure that you cover your bread and butter issues. And it essentially shows that what the pool does is that it lowers the covariance of a pooled group of countries. So when you take each of these individual countries, looking at the annual average loss and the standard deviation that is calculated for each of these countries, what we do see is that the covariance of the portfolio drops from 2.63 to 1.447. I mean, this is something that a person in the insurance industry and something that Debbie is going to be a lot more familiar with than what I am. And then depending on the period of the coverage that you're going to be taking out, whether it's a 1 to 5 year retention, a 1 to 7 year retention, or 1 to 10 year retention. In the case of a 1 to 10 year retention, the market savings for the group of countries that are shown here is up to 52% savings. And I mean, this is not just snake oil that I'm selling to you. I mean, this is, any honest insurance broker is going to be able to present this to you with a great deal of credibility. So once again, some of the principles that have already been touched on is the benefits of contingency funds, immediate liquidity, lowers the cost of intervention, and also improves the whole system of financial and budgetary management. How is the risk quantified? Firstly, the hazard is determined by using a satellite-based rainfall data, and we will look at the software in the next slide. The vulnerability is essentially asking the question: who is at risk? Where are they? What are they growing? Or where do their herds graze? And then also it examines the exposure in today's procurement and logistics costs. How much will it cost to assist each potential person that is affected by the drought? The technical software that is used is called African Risk View, and it looks at rainfall, it looks at the drought index, the populations affected, and also the cost. And then you can see the second window on my right, your left, then shows the satellite imagery and also some of the screens that provide the outcome. So this is essentially the software and what is referred to as the technical engine that the African Risk Capacity will be using. There are two members in the audience here that work full-time for the African Risk Capacity, and I'm sure that if there are more technical questions that are posed that I'm not going to be able to answer, they will be more than happy to provide the explanation on that. So the African Risk Capacity, and I'm told to stop. I think that this is well known and well covered by previous presenters, and also something that I've touched on in previous slides. So it's essentially a facility that is going to take a series of ex-ante measures in order to have a response that is developed before the event takes place. I'm not going to go through this, but what this basically shows is that there is an African Union level mandate for this. It's a discussion that has largely been undertaken by African finance ministers and also those ministers that are responsible for disaster risk reduction. And the facility now, because there's a resolution that's been taken by African finance ministers, this proposal will go to African heads of state when they meet the next time in Addis. This just sets out some of the steps that we are taking moving forward. About 18 missions have been conducted, meaning 18 countries have been visited. South Africa is not a country that has been visited, so we're still planning that workshop to take place with the people involved in this business in South Africa. Technical workshops have been undertaken, and at least 6 pre-participation agreements have already been concluded. The goal is to raise 200 million US. There are initial commitments of capital of 90 million. In terms of the institution that will be established, as we said, this is a decision of the AU Summit. A meeting of government experts has taken place. There's been a validation workshop in terms of how these things work. Sometimes, you get bogged down by multilateral bureaucracy, but sometimes it is good to follow those procedures. The next step would be a meeting of plenipotentiaries. I'm still not too sure who that grouping of people are. I'm told they kind of represent the heads of state. And then we have a conference of parties that will look at the incorporation of the ARC as a specialized agency of the African Union, which will then incorporate a fund, which will be the insurance fund that will be operated. There are some additional slides. I'm sure this is going to be posted on the website or handed out, which you can further examine. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Neil. There's always a tendency not to really impose on the people that hold the purse, because ultimately at some point in time I have to go back to them and ask for money. And he will remind me that the day that we told him to stop while he was so eloquently presenting his presentation. Neil, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to have a question and answer session. And any issues that anybody wants to raise that they think that could support some of the presentations that we do have. We have about 15 minutes to deal with this. And we'll see how we take the process forward from there. Yeah. Can we ask the panelists to come and join us up here so that they are closest to the microphones, so that they can deal with all the difficult questions they're going to be asked?
So what I will suggest that we take a series of 3-4 questions to start, and then we're going to ask our panelists to answer them. Again, feel free to be candid, provocative. It's the purpose of this session is really to not only to complement what was presented, but also through the presentations to trigger additional discussion or comments from the floor. So who wants to start? I don't know if we have a mic in the. I think we have a mic. It will be easier because I think the session is recorded. So if you could briefly introduce yourself and ask a kind of quick and short question.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Sashin Murray. I'm representing Conservation South Africa, an affiliate of Conservation International. Thank you very much to all of the speakers. I just wanted to comment really on the fact that I'm in very encouraged by the fact that there's a lot of mention about preventative measures and thinking about acting before the disaster. What I wanted to ask specifically, possibly to Treasury, or actually if anyone wants to respond, in terms of the funding that's going into that preventative response, how much is focusing in terms of looking at our ecosystems and supporting developing ecological infrastructure? Thank you.
Another question we can take, please. The mic has to come.
Thank you very much. Mami Razakanev from Madagascar, director of the implementation of SRAC 2. The assurance mechanism is a very quite new aspect in Africa, and in order to understand very well it, we need to have many sensibilization and good information for the country in the organization and the government in Africa. I have one question with the Swiss cooperation. How is how to have the how to support the country to have the risk profile and assessment, and I don't know if you can support the country to, because it is important to put the contingency fund first, and after we can go with the insurance and different country bond and so on. Thank you very much.
Very good point. Further question? Maybe a third one before we ask our panelists to answer.
Good morning. I am Sanjay Agrawal from India. I just want to know how the reinsurance is effective in disaster risk financing. Can you throw some light on that, on the reinsurance? Thank you.
Sorry, what do you mean by reinsurance being effective? Can you elaborate?
In one of the presentation, reinsurance was told that it is part of the disaster risk financing.
Okay.
So I just want to know how it will be effective for the risk financing.
Okay, thank you. Good, let's start answering the questions. So the first one about the preventive management and the impact on ecosystem, maybe from Treasury of South Africa, what's your experience on that?
Thank you. I suppose I'm going to have to provide a very unfair response to the question and say that every second year there's an open budget index that is undertaken by the International Budget Partnership, and for the 2010 Open Budget Index, South Africa scored #1. So we have the most open budget. We beat the US into second place. We beat the UK into third place. So if you take a South African budget document, you should be able to find out what we spend on government programs. So I'm not going to be able to provide you with that answer. I don't work in the budget office, so it's not a figure or a program that I'm going to be able to rattle off because I'm not that familiar with how and what programs allocations are made on. I work in the International Economic Policy Division of the Treasury. But let me assure you, 2008 we came second. In 2010 we took first spot as the most open, having the most open budget. So what I do volunteer to do is to sit with you after the session. We go through the budget documents, and I'm sure we will quite easily be able to ascertain whether the South African government is providing enough funds for the kind of measures that I certainly believe are important for governments to allocate their money for. Thanks.
Okay, Neil. Manuel, do you have any further comments on the Mexican experience on that, in a few words?
There is a concern again. There are preventing measures that we've been taking. Particularly, we cover a zone in Yucatan where Cancun is. I think that I should use this word, Cancun, and that there is a very biodiversified zone. But again, these are financial protections. And I just want to say that.
Okay, thank you, Manuel. The second question from the gentleman from Madagascar to Marcus on the need for additional, I would say, exposure and capacity building on risk assessment and risk financing, what SECO and other donors are doing.
Yes, thanks. Sorry. How do I? It's on. Okay, do you hear me? Because, well, I don't hear if you hear me. Indeed, it's a very valid and very relevant question. That is actually why we started this endeavor. We've partnered up with the World Bank exactly on that and went into a partnership on financial risk management. What we're doing in there, what the portfolio of activities entails is indeed to start with the catastrophe risk modeling. So you first, I'm going to reiterate actually what you have seen in all the presentations and just put it together comprehensively. You first need to know where your risk is. So you first start with your modeling. Then you assess the economic and fiscal impact of that risk. In this case, the natural disaster. You'll have a review of your fiscal management of natural disasters. So you basically match that with what you have at hand already and what the possibilities could be. You'll have a look whether you have a catastrophe insurance regulatory framework at hand in the country in order to manage that. If you haven't, probably that would be a way to go and look into it, what you could do better there. And finally, you do capacity transfer and training on sovereign disaster risk financing strategies, so that if you haven't, after that program, you're incapacitated and you can go down further the line, and for the next event, be prepared and do it on your own. Probably I just put on here like what reinsurance companies can do in that. As I said before, if you don't get a private mechanism, financing mechanism involved, the country, well, basically Treasury at the very end, will act as a reinsurer of last resort anyway. So the question is, are you able, with a diversified set of mechanisms, to reinsure at least a part of these risks with private reinsurance companies in order to be covered? I mean, probably in Southern Africa it's less obvious than in the Indian or Asian Pacific example, where the tsunami, I think, gave the best example, that you can have a risk which is rather high, where you want to see what you're going to do with, because basically if it hits you, it is detrimental to the country and you can't help yourself out on your own. And that is exactly where we see the role of the private market as well, of reinsurance companies who can cover at least a part of that. Fair enough to say they can't cover everything, and you probably as a country wouldn't like a reinsurance company to cover everything, because your premiums, as our Malawian colleague said, will also then be questioned in Parliament. And you need to find the right balance, and you need to find the right mix, which is also corresponding to your capabilities as a country and as a treasury there.
Thank you, Marcus. Just to elaborate a bit on that, I'd also like to highlight what you said in your question, the importance of combining instruments, and the importance of a kind of proper financial risk profile to identify the right instruments between contingency planning, between budgets, contingency credit to some extent, and ultimately for the top layers, insurance. And as you may know, in Madagascar, for example, the global facility for disaster reduction and recovery is already active on disaster risk management and on disaster risk financing. The third question before we go through the next round of questions was about, from our colleague from India, about the reinsurance and how effective is reinsurance. I guess, Manuel, you can share your experience, your recent experience with the fund.
Thank you, Olivier. Yes, I think that the reinsurers are effective in several sense. At least two on the top of my mind is that they provide technical assistance to develop a risk financing strategy, and also they help us to build the models that Marcus was referring to. We have a model in Mexico, and they have other models that they provide, and together with these models can give you a better assessment of the risk. Also, in that technical part, the World Bank has been partnering with Mexico and has been very important in that. On the second part, at least in the first losses insurance, international reinsurance has been very active, providing funding to local insurance. And we have the Mexican government has a partnership with the two main reinsurers, and they, in case of a disaster, they're going to provide with the funds. Let me tell you that in 2010 there was an important earthquake in the northern part in Mexico, in Baja California, what they call Baja. There was an estimated losses for the government of around $100 million, and the insurance paid a very important part of it. So the insurance are effective at least in these two ways. Thank you, Olivier.
Okay, thank you. Again, just to elaborate on that, the way we also been interacting with the reinsurance market is at two levels. First of all, as you know, the reinsurance market will provide reinsurance capacity, financial capacity, but we should not also underestimate their technical expertise to help countries ultimately and insurance companies to design proper solutions. We still have a few minutes before we ask Anthony Julis to give his closing remarks. So maybe we can take a second set of questions. Madam?
Good morning, my name is Marty Werepal. I run an NGO involved in disaster distress relief. My question would be, in the case of insurance, how would you roll this down to the lowest level of funding in the South African government, down to your local municipal level?
Good morning, everyone. I'm Fatou Yang from the African Risk Capacity. I'd be very interested in the experience of Malawi because we are eager, while we're building the ARC, to learn from probably your experience and your potential improvements to your maize index facility. I would like to know what type of contingency plans do you have in place related to your insurance contract, your put option contract, and then why do you feel that you have to improve on the index? As in, is there a discrepancy between what you're seeing on the ground versus what your meteo stations are recording? And also, what are the improvements that the Malawi government is suggesting at this time to improve their risk financing solution? Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, friends. My name is Tebogo Gaolaului. I'm coming from the PDMC, Limpopo province. I had two questions that I want to ask, but fortunately, the lady just asked the one on the rollout based on the insurance in order to go down into the municipalities, your local municipalities. The question that I would like to get is that we are talking about the paradigm shift, where we are going away from spending too much money on response, but rather to come with educational programs in order to minimize the risk that we are facing. Now, the very question that I would like to know is to take that one of the NDMC having collaborated with the business in order to make sure that we engage in the insurance. But one of the most important questions, and we know that we cannot predict the weather, is the question to ask that what is the target date? Because the problem is that too much money is lost in response and recovery. Taking with the insurance, saying that we put on the insurance in order to not actually to pause the risk, but in order to minimize the risk. What is the target date for South Africa to collaborate with business? Thank you.
Thank you.
My name is Philip Boulay. I'm from the Islands Project of the Indian Ocean Commission. I was very much impressed by all that was said, but we've been talking about risks like flood, like drought. What about new risks, or, well, let's say risks that are coming, like coastal floods, like damage to infrastructures around coasts, like damage to what is sometimes called tourism infrastructure? Is there a possibility of going into that, or is it too early to start thinking about it?
Okay, last question maybe.
Good morning. I'm from the UN ISDR Regional Office for Africa. I have a question about the ARC. And my question is, obviously in DRR we're trying to find long-term solutions and long-term change. So is there a provision that, for example, the contingency plans that you base the payouts on, that there are any sort of long-term solutions that should be also addressed by the payouts, or is it simply, let's say, food aid and getting back to the normal situation? Thank you.
Okay, good. Let's try to group a bit the questions. Let's start with the first question about the insurance at the sub-sovereign level, municipal level. I'd like to invite maybe more. Why don't you start, Manuel, because you have some experience in Mexico, and maybe then we can ask Neil to comment from South Africa.
Yes, the federal government has some experience transferring natural hazard risk to the financial markets, international financial markets, and this experience have been sharing with the state governments, not at exactly the municipal level yet, but that is the expansion plan. And also with the World Bank, recently been working on a facility. You know, Mexico is a large country, as is South Africa, so there are about pooling risk. There are potential for pooling risk in some states of Mexico, and this is at the local level, and this was going to be very helpful for them to pool the risk, the natural hazards, and to transfer them to the financial markets. I think this is very important, and I think we need to build a better prepared society at that level. Thank you.
Neil, quickly on
Thank you very much, Olivier. I mean, there's, I suppose, many people in the room that are more familiar with how things or how the response works currently. What we are saying with ARC is that there'd be a much faster disbursement of funds. The mere fact that this facility is a country-owned or African-owned facility means that the decisions that are going to be taken on how the funds that are made available are going to be programmed will reside with the government. I mean, if you think of the South African experience, I mean, there's obviously legislation that one needs to take into account, in particular, Public Financial Management Act, and probably more importantly, the Intergovernmental Fiscal Relations Act, which is going to determine which sphere of government needs to take responsibility to respond to the event that has taken place. I mean, many of you will be familiar that in South Africa we have national government, provincial and local government. Some of the functions are accorded to the specific sphere. Other functions are concurrent functions. So we have a National Disaster Management Center. One would imagine that a disbursement out of ARC would work very similarly to the way that if money is made available to respond to a disaster, how our Department of Corporate Governance and our National Disaster Management Center is going to program that money would be very similar to the way that it is currently programmed as part of a normal public financial management. But just to say that I think it's a very important question, because the idea here is that you do want this facility to provide faster disbursement, and it's not just faster disbursement to the revenue fund of a country. You want faster disbursement from the revenue fund of that country to the municipalities or the people that have been affected by the disaster, and it's certainly you know, as a member country of the African Union, it is certainly something that South Africa would want to see the ARC being able to provide for, and that is that fast disbursement of the money once the country receives it to those that are most affected by the disaster. Can I just come back to an earlier question on the reinsurance, and also just say that, I mean, there are several models that are being tested for ARC. What I said was that there's a transfer from governments to the ARC. There's also a risk level that would result in a transfer of the risk from ARC to reinsurance companies. There are several companies that ARC is working with, Swiss Re, Munich Re, and others. And the model that ARC is looking at is very similar to the Caribbean Risk Facility in terms of a reinsurance facility for the ARC. Thanks.
Thank you, Neil. Daisy, maybe some comments on the contingency plan developed by the government of Malawi, if there is one.
Thank you, and thanks to the colleague from ARC. Indeed, in Malawi we have some plans. Within the budget, there is a vote on unforeseen circumstances, but when a disaster strikes, the usual problems of accessing those resources timely remains an issue. But nice to say that due to the political will on the part of the government, I think the number of policy frameworks being developed, trying to put bits and pieces together so that we are well positioned to tackle issues of disaster, including agricultural risk, which I'm passionate about. And I think on the adjustments that we are making in view of the initiative by is it WFP, the Africa Risk Capacity? African Union. Okay. Yeah. In fact, as I said during my presentation, we are actually like at a crossroads where we are rethinking our position to say which way do we go. We have these different alternatives or approaches that we can use. One of which that we are considering is going the Africa Risk Capacity way. And to that effect, Mr. Chairman and ladies and gentlemen, you may want to hear that we had a mission from Africa Risk Capacity. We have been interacting with them. Currently, we are reviewing an MOU, which is supposed to govern the process. We want to look at it critically so that we are not in the same vein where we want to understand it properly and make sure that the recommendations we make to government are well informed. So we are very much into it, and I think the policymakers know about this. Yeah, so one of the alternatives is Africa Risk Capacity, and the probability is very high that we might go that way as well, or in addition to the other approaches that are in place. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Daisy, I'm afraid we're running out of time, and I would like now to invite Anthony Julie, who is Chief Director, Strategy and Risk Management, National Treasury from the Government of South Africa, to give his closing remarks to this session. Thank you.
Thank you, Flavia. It's been a useful discussion, considering also that we've had you come from the World Bank a day before Independence Day, so you'll be celebrating your Independence Day here in the southern tip of Africa. This is certainly a very important topic, discussion. There's so much talk these days about developments in the Eurozone. I've just returned from an IMF discussion around just trying to keep the euro intact. And here we have the Swiss government talking about supporting financing disaster relief. So I think that just talks to the significance of this topic. Disasters certainly is a major threat to developing countries, to emerging markets in particular. We've not had the situation in emerging markets in particular that developed and advanced economies have had as a result of the crisis that has erupted in the advanced economies. Our stimulus packages in the emerging markets have indeed been infrastructure spending. In particular in South Africa, we've spent significant amounts on infrastructure and strategic infrastructure for that matter, both as government as well as our state-owned entities. Over the medium term expenditure framework, that's a 3-year period, we're planning to spend over $100 billion, okay, over 844 billion rands on public infrastructure. Over the period to 2020, as government and as the public sector, we're planning to spend over $400 billion, US dollars, over 3.2 trillion rand on infrastructure, strategic infrastructure. In addition to all the spending in infrastructure as government that we are planning to do over this period, we also have in South Africa, and I'm sure in many advanced and emerging economies, in developing economies and emerging economies, we have social challenges, enormous social challenges. We have a national development plan that we are implementing that seeks to create jobs, where in the past we've not really created jobs. We've had some growth, but we've not created jobs. We have a very high unemployment of 25% in South Africa. We are expanding infrastructure, where we've seen infrastructure, the lack of spending in infrastructure has led to infrastructure crumbling. We are also building a capable state where we know public service in areas have become inefficient and uneven. We are fighting corruption, where we know how widespread it is, both in the private and in the public sectors. We are providing quality education and healthcare, knowing that we have very poor quality of education. And the burden of disease is indeed very high. And we are also looking at inclusive planning, rather than the exclusive planning. And therefore, considering all of these challenges and the significant investments that we are making and the development plan that we are implementing, it is important that we cannot, as government, put these plans at risk by not really understanding the implications of natural disasters and what it can mean and how it, in fact, can derail our plans. And therefore, it becomes necessary that we understand and that we use information and management systems. And that is key, really, to devise cost-effective and time-efficient disaster risk financing and insurance solutions. This really implies that every country must understand its own exposure, and this is key. You need to understand, as a country, your exposure to natural disasters. This is a prerequisite, really, to developing financial protection strategies and conducting cost-benefit analysis of investments and risk mitigation. And this is also a prerequisite. This understanding of your natural disasters is also a prerequisite for really effectively being able to transfer catastrophic risk to the private sector. Now, when you talk about financing disaster recovery, there are two streams of financing in the event of a disaster, and has been referred to by the speakers. It's necessary to find this optimal mix between these two streams of financing. The one is a short, immediate response to a recovery, and that is really to ensure that that all the negative effects are minimized and that service delivery is not compromised. And these instruments are essentially ex-ante instruments. These are instruments that are available before the event of a disaster. And they caters for immediate injection. And then you have a longer-term response, and the longer-term response really looks at the rehabilitation of infrastructure, medium to longer-term intervention. And this is essentially funded through the budget or other adjustments in the budget. But it's also in this area, in the longer-term type of response, that a partnership with the private sector is useful, because you can imagine when it comes to a catastrophic event, the cost will certainly be very high, and the fiscus, the budget, would certainly not be sufficient to bear those costs. Now, given the magnitude of these resources that are required in the event of a disaster, we need to draw on experiences. And I think what we've had, the discussion we've had this morning, is really drawing on experiences of people who have expertise in this area, and countries who have expertise in this area. And really the objective of drawing on existing expertise and experience is really to increase the speed with which the state can respond, and also increasing the financial response capacity, while at the same time, as a state, you are reducing the financial vulnerability of the state to natural disasters. Now, two things are important when it comes to natural disaster, because it is a contingent liability, and when you deal with contingent liabilities, you need to know, one, you need to know the size of the contingent liability, and that is an exercise on its own. And therefore, you need the expertise in order to assist in that area, to determine the loss potential. And the second important point when dealing with a contingent liability like a natural disaster is to know the likelihood and the probability of a natural disaster. Now, I'm just going to conclude, and I think coming from the National Treasury, we can't be standing and talking without making reference to numbers, and I have already made reference to numbers, and I am Neil would attest to that, a good public servant. So coming from the Treasury, we need to just talk about some numbers. In government, we have made available, and I'm not suggesting that these amounts are at all, sufficient to deal with disasters that might hit South Africa. But there are two grants, specific grants that are made available, and this is recent grants that have been introduced. One, a provincial disaster grant, as well as a municipal disaster grant, and this is on budget. And over the medium term, an amount of 1.6 billion rand is available or has been made available for both the provinces and municipalities. We have, and we know we don't, this is not dedicated to disasters, but we have on budget a contingency financing. And it's not always good to talk about this contingency financing when the labor unions are aware that there's a contingency financing. So when it comes to labor wage negotiations in the public sector, they always look at what amount is available in addition to what has been provided for wage increases. But there's a contingency financing on budget as well of 42 billion over the medium term that can be utilized for disasters. And certainly we have, as all countries, we have built up reserves, official reserves, in the event of real disasters, and we have about $50 billion amount in our official reserves to face whatever contingency crisis situation we might find ourselves in. So with that numbers note, I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Anthony. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your presence, and I'm sure that those of you that attended the Ignite session last night, the impact that Laura had is visible here today. Thank you very much, Laura. You had a full house for us. Ladies and gentlemen, tea is served on the ground floor before the next session starts. Thank you very much for all your participation and for the presenters.